Welcome, everybody, and thanks very much for joining this E3G media briefing today. My name is Leo Roberts. I lead our energy transition work here at E3G, and I'll be moderating. So a bit of context. Today, we'll be talking through the forthcoming first conference on fossil fuel phase out, kicking off in Santa Marta in Colombia later this week. But we'll also be able to answer questions about why Santa Marta matters in the context of the wider global energy transition landscape. Obviously, we're speaking in the middle of a hugely turbulent geopolitical context. The US-Israeli war on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz have triggered chaos in the global oil and gas market. It's led to flights being grounded, including flights to Colombia, due to a lack of aviation fuel. Concerned Asian economies implementing emergency measures to restrict car usage, a whole raft of responses. But it's also seen a growing number of countries increasingly open about their intention to move away from fossil fuels on the basis of reducing exposure to these chaotic global oil and gas markets, but also on the basis of the clear economic and hard security benefits, all of which makes the Santa Marta conference extremely timely. So before we start, a few housekeeping points. This will all be on the record. Please do let us know if you wish to use specific quotes, in which case we'd be happy to give you more context or detail. Please raise a hand to ask a question or post in the Q&A function. We'll aim to answer some of the questions as we hear them. As we receive them. We'll be starting with some very brief framing comments from our expert speakers, but please do feel free to post your questions as soon as they pop into your mind. Then we'll be leaving plenty of time for questions and discussion. We're aiming to finish by about 12:45, but you can follow up with our press team if any questions are not covered. We'd be very happy to talk to you beyond this call. A very quick introduction to our speakers. So we have Kat Peterson, who will be speaking to international energy transition diplomacy, the relationship between Santa Marta and the UNFCCC and the COP. Beth Walker is joining us and will be speaking to the fossil fuel producing country angle and wider global economic dynamics and national economic dynamics. And we have Yunjung Lee, who will be able to speak to why investor-state dispute settlement matters and why it's emerging as a key theme at Santa Marta and in the wider world. So without further ado, over to you, Kat, to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leo, and hi, everyone. A couple of very quick reflections from me, and then we can get going into questions and have plenty of time for more detail. But as Leo mentioned, I will just say a few words about what's at stake in Santa Marta, why it matters right now, and what we can expect and should be looking for from it. So I'm not going to say too much about the broad framing of the conference, as I think everyone here probably already knows that it is the first ever conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, was launched during COP30 last year, and it's going to be bringing together a bunch of stakeholders across governments, academia, CSOs, and business. We're expecting about 50 countries showing up, and the flow will be the start of starting with an academic conference and then finishing with a high-level segment for countries to really talk through concrete solutions. The set of countries that we're expecting is very varied, which is good. We'll have major developed producers there, Norway, Canada, Australia. We'll have developing producers like Nigeria, Mexico, and Brazil. Key importers like the EU and its many member states, and also coal-using countries like Turkey and Vietnam. And I think one main point to really emphasize is how significant it is that this amount of countries, all in different parts of their kind of transition pathways, are showing up in Santa Marta, not to talk about whether there is a transition and whether it should happen, but how to move it along and how to make it equitable and orderly. And it reflects, I think, that we're at a point where political leaders are really increasingly seeing fossil fuels not as a source of security anymore, but as a source of risk, a source of volatility, and they want to work together to address those risks and to also reap the benefits of the transition for their economies. And in the context of the current geopolitical climate, I think that's also important because it shows that international cooperation is alive and kicking, and the fact that some countries are able and willing to go faster on the toughest parts of the transition than what is possible within consensus-based processes like the COPs and the UNFCCC. Doesn't mean that those spaces aren't working. It means a maturing of spaces for international cooperation on this very challenging topic. We need the global agreements of the COP to set global direction. That's why we have the commitment to global transition away from fossil fuels to begin with. And then we need these types of focused coalitions to come together in Santa Marta to advance faster on tough issues and then play that ambition back into the broader multilateral space. But the key question for Colombia and the Netherlands and the countries showing up in Santa Marta is, of course, I think how to make sure this conference isn't just a one-off, but that it's the start of a process for that cooperation and that it's also driving concrete action, as well as supporting other multilateral processes like the COP30 roadmap led by the Brazilian presidency and also broader UNFCCC cooperation. And so I think that means we need to see a couple of things from the conference that we are all going to be looking out for. We need to see a clear plan coming out for how the coalition that's gathering in Santa Marta is going to sustain their cooperation and how they're going to feed insights from it and from the dialogues they're having into the COP30 roadmap led by Brazil, but also how they're going to build momentum towards COP31, keep energy transition on the political agenda in these spaces, and also starting to look towards the next global stocktake at COP33 in 2028, which is going to be a crucial moment for countries to come together and talk about the next set of collective energy goals that are going to inform NDCs and domestic plans. And the insights from Santa Marta and the follow-up process should be building in towards that. We need countries to align on a set of concrete actions that they're actually going to work together on going forward. We don't need a long shopping list. We also don't need this conference to solve every single question on the transition away from fossil fuels. It's just the first. But we do need a clear identification of some of the key solutions that countries want to work on to address structural barriers that aren't being addressed elsewhere or aren't being addressed comprehensively enough, which might include things like national whole economy roadmaps on fossil fuel transition, for example. And then we also need to see a really central discussion around finance and scaling support for all countries to be able to embark on the transition and for this coalition of doers and momentum builders to grow over time and that all countries can kind of start on this journey and not have to face its challenges alone. That's important for equity and for fairness, but it's also important because that kind of cooperation and support is essential to reduce economic volatility risks in global markets as the transition accelerates. And that would come with a two-tier transition that doesn't allow everyone to embark on it. We're not expecting any negotiated outcomes or declarations of the conference. We will have a chair summary, and that will include input to the COP30 roadmap, hopefully as well. And then one other thing we'll be looking out for is also what countries might say in the margins of Santa Marta, and also afterwards to reflect the kind of international space into their own domestic plans and accelerated action. But I'll stop there. We can come back on any pieces or anything else in questions, and I'll hand over to Beth to talk a bit more about fossil fuel producer dynamics.
Thanks, Kat, and hi everyone. So yeah, I'm going to just focus a little bit on the dynamics of producer countries and between different countries attending Santa Marta. I think Santa Marta, as Kat said, is landing at a moment when the world is being reminded in real time that fossil fuels are not only a climate problem, but a structural, geopolitical and economic risk. And that's both for producing and importing countries. And so recent escalations in the Middle East has exposed how deeply economies remain tied to fossil fuel volatility. And that is, however much you decarbonize at home, countries will still be exposed. And as we move deeper into the energy transition, when we have this world where we have both the fossil fuel and the new energy system on top of each other, we are likely to see increasing volatility and repeated events like is happening right now. And so countries need to come together in forums like Santa Marta to talk about how they can work together to kind of navigate and minimize this volatility during the transition as disruptions become more frequent and complex. I mean, just for an example, around 2/3 of the global oil and gas trade flows through a small number of choke points, not just the Strait of Hormuz. And so disruption is not an exception, it's built into our current system. At the same time, what we're seeing is that as a response to this crisis, countries are seeing building out renewable systems as the future of energy security. And just you can see from the UK announcements this week on structural market reforms to electricity markets to decouple the price of oil and gas, and to accelerate renewable rollout in a number of different ways and do more to protect households who are dependent on gas. And you can see it in the way that the EU is also vocalizing the energy transition as the future for economic and energy security. In the recent Foreign Affairs Council conclusions that also signal a more forthright EU on the diplomatic stage as well to support other countries in the transition. The impacts will be even more acute across import-dependent economies in Asia, where most of the Strait of oil and gas flow to, and we're already seeing price shocks feed directly into inflation, debt pressures, and strain on things like fertilizers, which will have knock-on impact. So this is also a long-winded way of saying that Santa Marta comes at a very important moment as a place where countries can come together to address some of these issues in practice. And I think Kat alluded to what is very interesting about the mix of countries coming. So it's not just the usual suspects. You have countries who are very dependent on oil and gas. For example, Angola, who relies on over 60% of its government revenue from oil and gas, very dependent on China as a customer and importer, and so is really having to look how it can rapidly diversify in this kind of new world it finds itself in. And again, importing countries shouldn't only care about their own TAF process, and that's what's so kind of positive about Santa Marta is that recognition that it's not just about enabling energy sector decarbonisation, it's actually about enabling the conditions for oil-producing countries, gas-producing countries to transition as well. So the key question I will be looking at coming out of Santa Marta is how are countries stepping forward to think about the shift for fossil fuel dependent countries in a way that will prevent and minimize future instability in the energy and geopolitical systems. And we are actually publishing a report next month that unpacks some of these dynamics and that looks at the pathways that producers will take as oil demand starts to fall. And this is a future that might be kind of closer than we think now, given economies are thinking about how to move faster in decarbonisation and reduce exposure to these systemic choke points. So I think what we will be watching coming out of Santa Marta is the crucial signals. And I think Kat set out very clearly what Santa Marta is and isn't and what to expect. But I think looking for what are the conversations going on about support for these more vulnerable producer economies dependent on fossil fuel revenues and how consumer producer countries can support each other with that. What are the signs that countries are coming forward to think about this credible whole economy transition? It's not just an energy shift, it's an economic wide shift. And what are the kind of how to link national plans into these global roadmap processes and link climate, energy and economic security. And then third, the signals of continued cooperation. You know, we hope that Santa Marta conversations will lay the groundwork, but it will be that sustained coordination going forward and feeding into COP30 and beyond. So I think just to reiterate Kat's point, we are not seeing this as a one-off event, but it's a process to manage what is a very significant economic and geopolitical shift. I think I now hand over to Njung.
Thank you, Beth. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this media briefing. I am going to talk briefly about ISDS, investor state dispute settlements, which has been drawing some attention recently thanks to Santa Marta conference. So Santa Marta conference is the first international climate conference centrally discussing these legal and financial barriers that can hinder transition away from fossil fuels. And despite its impact on the fossil fuel transition and wider climate action, this topic actually has been nearly absent in climate discussion so far. So the fact that ISDS is on the main agenda at Santa Marta is already a step forward. And we think Santa Marta provides a key opportunity to mobilize political support for addressing ISDS and establish ISDS reform as a necessary component of accelerating the fossil fuel transition. And for those not familiar with ISDS, these are provisions included in most trade and investment agreements between countries to manage disputes between foreign investors and host country. And these provisions allow foreign investors to host governments in private international arbitration tribunal if they believe the host government has not kept its promises about how their investment would be treated. For more details, you can have a look at our recently published ISDS explainer. So there are more than 2,500 agreements globally, and most of those trade and investment agreements include ISDS. So reforming one treaty by one treaty would be very time-consuming. So governments need to come together on coordinated solution. And what can be done at national levels is governments can reduce their exposure to ISDS risks by no longer including ISDS provisions in new treaties and amending existing treaties to remove or substantially reform ISDS provision. And going further, like-minded countries can create a plurilateral instrument that can amend existing treaties in a more efficient way. So Santa Marta can help start this journey by recognizing the risks that ISDS poses to fossil fuel phase out and the urgent need to collectively address them. There is currently no such a recognition among states, so consolidating awareness and creating political momentum is the first step to advance the agenda, both at national and global levels, which we're hoping to see coming out from Santa Marta. And progress in Santa Marta could then encourage other international venues and platforms to integrate ISDS reform agenda too, such as TAF roadmap process led by the Brazilian COP30 presidency and Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade launched last year, helping position it as a key climate issue and driving broader global action. And Australia's policy against ISDS, together with its role as COP31 co-host, can also create an opportunity to make progress on ISDS reform at COP31. I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions you might have on this specific topic. Thank you, and back to Leo.
Thank you very much, Jing, Beth, and Kat. Super helpful framing comments. So we can now open up to questions from anybody who's on the line. We've got about 25 minutes, half an hour, so please do put them into the Q&A function or raise your hands. Maybe I can start with the question which I think came from John in the chat and pass to you, Kat. You've answered some of this already, but I wonder if you could speak to the nature of participation at Santa Marta. So who will participate and who will not participate, and why does this stuff matter? And in the meantime, just another encouragement, please do put your hands up and put Q&As in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo, and thanks for the question. So yeah, I spoke a bit to this in terms of outcomes of the conference that are expected, so I won't add too much more on that. But other than to say that it's it's not so much a space where we're expecting very concrete new commitments. We are expecting this chair summary and sort of momentum building and forward process into other multilateral processes as well, and this sort of outline of concrete solutions that the countries showing up will want to work together on going forward and how they will do that. It's worth flagging also that we are also expecting exciting things on the sort of scientific side of stuff. There's likely going to be the launch of a new science panel on fossil fuel transitions, which is a bit of a sort of IPCC for fossil fuel transition science, and should and will inform some of these processes, also including the COP30 roadmap, but also broader kind of science diplomacy and ensuring that the trajectories that countries are building out are actually based in the best and most recently available science. In terms of participation, so as mentioned, we are expecting that there will be about 50 countries there. I think as Beth also outlined, the number is significant. 50 countries showing up at this time, this current context to talk about this topic is very significant. But the diversity of countries there, in the sense that we both have producers and consumers willing to sort of have a cooperative conversation on how to build a global trajectory away from fossil fuels is really significant. We don't expect that all of those will be there at ministerial level, but some will. So it'll be a mix of ministers, climate envoys, and possibly from some countries also working level officials, which in many ways is great because this conversation is supposed to be about concrete and practical ways of working together. Yes, it is about signaling, but it's also about getting into the weeds of kind of transition, economic planning, and having people who are familiar with those details is going to be quite important for the sort of substance of the conversations that we want Santa Marta to lead to as well. 50 countries is obviously not all countries, and there are some big producers and big consumers who won't be in the room. I think it's worth remarking on that, but also recognizing that doesn't mean that those countries, firstly, aren't watching what's happening, and will be and might want to engage going forward, and also that I think, the fact that ultimately you don't need all countries to drive global progress. You need a starting point, and then you need a coalition that can expand over time and show how it can and will be useful. And I think that's what we're expecting to see from Santa Marta, from some of the big economies. Ultimately shaping the direction of these conversations is a huge opportunity for their own ability to lead, for their own ability to kind of reap the rewards of building out their own clean energy transitions and also shape the global trajectory. And so kind of forward momentum and growing this coalition and having more and more countries on board, I think is probably going to happen. But this is already a very, very strong starting point. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kat. That's a really comprehensive answer. We have another question from Sarah in the chat, which is around countries that are already accelerating the shift to renewables, but will need support to get there, and how Santa Marta can help to facilitate this support. So Beth, maybe I can come to you first, and then Kat and Anjung, you might want to come in with answers as well. And just another encouragement, please do put your hands up, put your questions in the chat. No need to be shy. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. I think that although the conference is framed around looking for solutions, but it's solutions to some of the systemic barriers that certain countries face in accelerating their own transition. So for developing countries, having the kind of fiscal space to invest in renewables, for those countries who are reliant on fossil fuel revenue, it's how do you work towards replacing that revenue in the long term and diversifying your economy from a very different base. And I think there's obviously issues also around debt, particularly in this kind of inflationary environment where servicing debt is becoming a major issue for many countries, and they don't have that fiscal space to invest in their own transition. So it's what are the support packages, what are the reforms that can help countries at different phases of their transition move forward. And I welcome particularly that there's a big focus on the fiscal dependence point, and also how actors like the IMF and other international finance institutions can support countries in their transition too. And so I think that's very very positive that will kind of grow over time, and that Santa Marta is focusing on that as well.
Thanks, Beth. Kat, did you want to come in on that? And also, I was going to pass you Matt's question in the chat, which is around the extent to which Santa Marta is a response to the COPs being plagued by fossil fuel producers who are getting in the way of the consensus-based approach. So maybe you can take those two together. Thank you.
I can do, yeah. So just building on firstly what Beth said around accelerating the shift to renewables, there are lots of concrete things that countries can be doing in the space also in terms of like some of the technical and regulatory stuff that really needs to accelerate. So there's lots of important needs for investment in grids and storage to kind of enable countries to go faster on their renewables transitions. Mobilizing the finance for that is going to be really important, and having conversations around that in Santa Marta could be useful. There's also a big conversation this year, an increased focus on the need for sort of faster move towards electrification. Ultimately, if you if you're building out clean power, you will need more of it, and you can grow demand and kind of boost your transition faster if you also electrify more different sectors. And that, as a sort of important pillar of the energy transition, is also something that countries are talking about and might come up in the Santa Marta context as well, how to collectively move that forward. But I think it's been very interesting to see some of the responses from particular countries that we've had in the context of the current crisis, and really accelerating the renewables transition at home. We've seen countries like Indonesia come out and, you know, turbocharge their commitment to build 100 gigawatts of solar in the next 3 years. They currently have 1 gigawatt, and talking about that in the context of doing it because coal is now increasingly a resource of or a kind of a resource of last use. And, you know, that type of rhetoric, and then actually seeing how countries are implementing it in practice, is also what we'll see conversations around in Santa Marta. In terms of the sort of the blocking tactics of fossil fuel producers and that informing Santa Marta, I think it's probably fair to say that, you know, the COPs have been slow at moving forward on addressing fossil fuels very proactively. It's not been that many years since that they were first mentioned in a negotiated text, and the fact that kind of Santa Marta came out of COP 30 last year, when there were all of these conversations around the roadmap, but also that those were difficult to progress in consensus spaces, has, I do think, of course, informed the desire to have a different venue and a different space where countries, where those that want to move forward faster and really start to get into the weeds of the detail, can do that. I don't think that that is a sign that the consensus-based processes are not seen as important, and that they're not working, and that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. The COPs are, you know, the sort of the big tents where everyone agrees the direction of travel. Again, we are only talking about a global commitment to transition away from fossil fuels because it was cemented in a COP text at COP 38. But Santa Marta is then almost like the sort of side room where those that are ready to go can get into the weeds of the details and really start to hammer those out. And then what happens in those side rooms, in that almost smaller group, can feed back into the COP process. And practically this year, that's going to look like is informing the Brazil-led COP30 roadmap on TAF. And it's also going to inform how countries think about the next global stocktake, as I mentioned earlier, and what set of collective goals are necessary there, but also how countries can build NDCs and climate plans that align with the necessary trajectory on fossil fuels, and actually making that feasible and showing that it's happening is what Santa Marta can do. It gives countries confidence to then want to come into the COP spaces and raise ambition, and also be more constructive because they see that this is happening, and they feel that there will also be support ready for them to go further. And that interplay is, you know, I think a maturing of international cooperation, and something that we need to see.
Thanks, Kat. There are lots of overlapping questions, so I might break these up slightly. Hopefully that at least partially answered the anonymous question around whether the 50 countries who are attending put enough pressure on those who aren't particularly the big fossil fuel producers, but maybe we can come back to that if not. Beth, I wonder if I could turn to you. So the first part of Nick Perry's question is around concerned that some of the fossil fuel producing countries that are going to be at Santa Marta haven't really sent clear signals about phasing out fossil fuels domestically, or even expanding their production. So why are these countries turning up? What do they get out of it? And perhaps I can ask you at the same time to touch on Berta's question around what the current geopolitical and energy crisis is doing for shaping the conference and the discussions. And then, Kat, I may come to you with some overlapping questions. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think I'm concerned about producer countries not sending the right signals about what they're doing at home. I think there is an interesting tension there, but I think it's very positive that even countries who are considering expanding still want to be involved in these conversations. But actually, you've got countries such as the UK, who is maintaining its ban on licensing. It is doubling down on renewables as a response to the crisis, is trying to reform its electricity market and progress towards kind of clean power targets. I think no one's pretending that this is an easy shift. And I think the fact that that this space has been created for some kind of candid conversations and sharing of experiences is positive. Although, of course, developed producers should be held to account as well. But I think that what we want to see is these countries vocalizing what they're doing at home and what they have to do, what else they have to do, and try and support other countries who are in a different point of their pathway. And I think there's also an opportunity for developed producers to support the more vulnerable producers as well. And as I said, the kind of volatility of the transition will affect every country. So it is in people's interests to come to the table and think about how they can work together. And that's what it shows, even though it will expose them to increased pressure and questioning over what they're actually delivering at home.
Thanks, Beth. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I just try and touch upon Bert's question. I mean, I think we've kind of covered in that actually the energy crisis and the geopolitical aspects have just brought it to the fore how important these conversations at Santa Marta are. And so I think that the fact that despite everything that's going on, countries are still turning up to talk about this is a testament to what the extent to which now this is considered a kind of economic security issue and not just climate. Although it's very important to keep those climate issues and bring them to the fore, because that urgency isn't going anywhere, and it will make all these challenges even more difficult to grapple with. So yeah, leave it there.
Thanks, Beth. Kat, you may want to come back on some of that, but I also wonder if I could steer you towards the second part of Nick's question, which is around making sure that countries that turn up to future editions of Santa Marta and indeed the COPs actually have to demonstrate that they are delivering the transition away from fossil fuels. So this is speaking to the idea of national pathways or national roadmaps and how to aggregate those up into the international space. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, that's a good question, Nick. So I think at this current stage, I wouldn't frame Santa Marta as something that should be kind of that there should be like a sort of gatekeeping exercise for participation. And at this stage, building the broadest possible coalition around the shared direction of travel and starting to get into the difficulties and the structural challenges of this transition and what's necessary to accelerate it is sort of the central imperative. And the value of the process is bringing together countries at various stages and sort of various levels of readiness, and creating space for that coordination rather than exclusion. But of course, the credibility of this long-term, the credibility of all international processes on climate is in whether they actually deliver actions to address emissions reduction, and also bring the benefits to countries at home that follow with that. But as Beth said, ultimately, because also we need to tackle climate change and stick within the commitments the countries have made under the Paris Agreement. And so the real test long term is how countries translate that international signaling into their domestic policy, into investment, and into implementation. The conversations around global cooperation, global roadmaps, this is also in the context of the Brazilian presidency's COP30 roadmap, ultimately needs to move into a space of looking at what does this mean for how countries are developing national roadmaps? How are they implementing the conversations at a global level into their domestic space? And at the moment, we don't actually have a body or anywhere that really tracks how countries are doing on fossil fuel transition. Particularly, we obviously have the IEA sort of doing kind of broad global tracking, but something that's really looking at a set of clear metrics and how countries are doing this and what's necessary to support them in going further and faster, specifically for this part of the transition, is currently a bit of a gap in the global governance space. And I do think it's interesting to explore what more is necessary to do that for transparency, and to ensure that kind of we are looking at both what developed countries are doing who can and should go further and faster and really starting to show a lot of more domestic progress, but also how these international cooperation spaces are actually delivering in the real economy over the long term, which is ultimately what we need to see.
Thanks, Kat. And I wonder if I could give you the almost impossible to answer question from the anonymous attendee around whether the makeup of countries that is there, you touched on some of this earlier, but the makeup of countries that will be there is enough to put pressure on big producers who do block the conversations at COPs, or just pressure on them more generally.
I think maybe the way to look at it is around not just the pressure, but also the opportunity for big producers to be able to shape the direction of travel of the global transition is a big opportunity. And there's a big business opportunity, there's a big economic growth opportunity. If you're China, you don't long term necessarily want to just stay on the sidelines of these conversations and let other countries come to the table and set the terms for how the transition accelerates and where it goes. You want to be part of leading those conversations. And I think the starting point of having countries come together in this way and to be quite a solid group, but that still needs to grow, is going to send that signal that this is a table that's worth sitting at, and that I think big producers will come to over time as well. But of course, that also requires showing that this is something that is going to deliver and that it's going to build progress going forward. And that will again be, I think, the central challenge, but also the central opportunity.
Thank you, Kat. Sorry, I realised that I was typing while unmuted there. That's all of the questions that we've had in so far. Would anyone like to raise a hand and ask a question verbally? Otherwise, perhaps I can come to you, and I'm aware that you haven't had a chance to speak so far. Is there anything that's come up so far in the chat that you'd like to raise around ISDS or Santa Marta?
Well, briefly on the shift to renewable. So I see the shift to renewable is like directly connected to transitioning away from fossil fuels, and Beth mentioned earlier the need to lift like barriers. So I think ISDS is one of those barriers that protects fossil fuel interest and therefore also locks in fossil fuel investment as well, which makes a transition away from fossil fuels into renewable harder. So I think it's very positive in that sense that it's is being treated as part of the wider transition agenda and discussion. And it's really a starting point in this topic as well. So we are hopeful that we can see some recognition of the threats and what that the state needs to act on the topic coming out from Santa Marta and throughout this year and beyond. That builds more momentum towards advancing the ISDS reform more globally.
Thanks, Jung. Beth, I might throw Sarah's question to you. So what are the risks around Santa Marta, and specifically, is there a risk of fragmentation between the countries that are really doubling down on the energy transition versus those that aren't?
I mean, in a way, you can't really get more fragmented than what we are now. I mean, in terms of you know, you've got we've got the US pushing its energy independence. We've got Russia, who is one of the short-term winners from this current conflict, as it's able to sell more of its oil and gas to Asia and in the markets because there's desperate need for it. So I don't think that's the risk. Actually, I think what this conference and other processes will do is bring countries who are pro accelerating the transition together to try and push this further. And I think what's happening now is showing us that no country can go this alone. And on the countries that are importing, there is a lot of leverage, in fact, that they have in the market and with producers. And I think it's hard to see this now when we're in the middle of a crisis. But in the long run, as the IEA is saying, the fossil fuel oil market is in structural decline. So there's the opportunity for importing countries to come together and think about how they can shape this and use their regulatory power, to use their buyers' power in different ways, and to support each other in more coordinated kind of market management. And I think, the kind of cheesy turning the risk into an opportunity, but I think given where we're at, these are the kind of conversations we need to have, and these are the kind of coordinated solutions countries need to be working through.
Thank you, Beth. We have a few minutes left, so please do put any final questions in. Kat, I'll come to you. You may have thoughts on Sarah's question as well, but I wonder if I can also ask you to answer the question from the anonymous attendee around whether we're likely to see fossil fuel lobbyists turning up in Santa Marta.
Yeah, I can just really briefly, I think Beth covered Sarah's question very well, but I think the one thing I would just add in terms of the kind of importance of not creating a two-tier transition and Santa Marta really responding to that is, I think, as Beth was saying, the current moment that we're in basically does show that it's not just important for equity, and it's not just important for kind of solidarity that the developed countries are supporting developing countries on the transition. It's also important for basically ensuring reduced volatility and fragility in the global energy transition, and kind of that attempt to avoid different speeds of transition by actually doing this as a cooperative feature is really essential. On the lobbying question, so my understanding is that Colombia and the Netherlands have run quite a tight process and have been very careful around ensuring that those who are attending are, again, organizations who are keen to talk about the how of the transition rather than the why and whether it should happen in the first place. Of course, there is also always a risk that, people who are lobbying for fossil fuels from various organizations will be there. But I think the expectation and the hope for this is that it will be a very constructive and engaged conversation and space for those who really want to have it, rather than those who are trying to avoid having that conversation, which is hopefully also something that will make it very productive.
Thank you very much, Kat. So we're at time. So just a quick one to say thank you very much to our speakers and to everybody for joining. We will be recording this, or we have recorded it. We'll be uploading it to the E3G website and our YouTube channel if you want to come back to it for reference. And please do get in touch with any of us directly and our media team. If you have any further questions, we'll be very happy to follow up with you. So unless there are any final burning questions, I'll say thank you again to everybody for speaking and joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. See many of you in Santa Marta. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.